Hold on, I just lost my screen.
Hello and good morning, and I'd like to welcome everyone once again to Policy Matters, which is a conversation between the Howard County Chamber and members of our Howard County General Assembly delegation. And so we are fortunate this morning that we have with us Senator Katie Hester,
Hi, everybody.
We will be sharing and talking about legislative policies. And so Katie has been certainly a great friend of the chamber and has always been willing to reach out and solicit our input and comments on various legislation. And so we certainly are glad to have her. And so again, welcome, Senator.
Thank you so much for having me, Leonardo. I really appreciate it. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank you for all the work that you've done on our bipartisan small business work group over the interim. We met like every other week for like 6 or 8 months, I think. So thank you for that.
Yeah. You're welcome. And so maybe what we'll do, Josh, I want to just give you an opportunity to say a few remarks, and then Senator Hester, if we would, let's go back and maybe share with our viewers exactly what is the small business work group and so forth. But first, Josh.
Well, thank you, Leonardo, and Senator, good morning.
Good morning.
And just, on behalf of Comcast, we are glad to be able to help support Policy Matters. It's just as we like to keep our customers connected during this time. Policy Matters helps to connect officials such as yourself with the larger community. So, Leonardo, back to you.
All right. So, Senator Hester, you mentioned the small business work group. And so certainly, as you mentioned, there were a lot of meetings taking place with a lot of members of the General Assembly, as well as some different business groups as well. So if you would share with us a little bit about what was that work group, just for those that may not know.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. So this is the Senate Bipartisan Small Business Working Group, and there's about 10 to 12 senators, depending on the day that you have met over the interim. I think we started actually about 18 years ago. In the spring of 2019. But this group just advocates for small business in the Senate. And what I think is kind of neat about it is not only that it's bipartisan, but that it's also members from each of the 4 committees, because small business issues do go to all 4 committees. And so having that kind of cross-pollination and small business sense, I think, is really helpful in terms of the practicality of how different pieces of legislation help small business. And I think the big things that we did this year, we did a lot of on-the-ground advocacy for small businesses in all of our districts. We advocated and wrote letters to our federal delegation to help with, things like additional funding in the PPP. We also wrote to the Board of Public Works, and some of our recommendations to the governor has taken up in his announcements. And then we've also, each member of course, has their own take on small business issues. And so we're each introducing, 1 or 2 pieces of legislation, which together kind of form a really nice, thoughtful, bipartisan package.
And so I guess maybe that's a good segue into talking about the session. And so what would be, just perhaps some of the legislation, or at least maybe concepts and ideas that have since been introduced, kind of stemming from this work group. I know you mentioned that the governor has taken some of the ideas, and some of the other concepts have made their way into legislation. And so maybe talk a little bit about what has transformed, at least what we're seeing now, as an offshoot of these meetings.
Okay. Well, of course, the really big thing that's happened in the past couple of weeks is that the governor has introduced his Relief Act, and the Senate on last Friday introduced the Recovery Now Amendment to the Relief Act. So I'll just quickly, give you the highlights of both, because I think this is really exciting. And it also shows how the governor's office and the Senate are working together. So the Relief Act at a very high level includes exemptions of COVID aid from Maryland taxation. It indemnifies the UI experience ratings for employers over the past year, which is great news for employers. UI stands for unemployment insurance ratings, obviously. And then it provides a sales and use tax credit for the small and medium-sized businesses, which is something that was recommended to our group over the interim. And then it also provides direct economic impact payments for Marylanders who received the Earned Income Tax Credit in 2019 and 2020. So the Senate leaves all of that intact and then adds on some additional funding for specific pieces of COVID relief. And I'm just going to highlight the ones that have to do with business, but there's a lot of really good stuff in there, including caseworkers to support our unemployment insurance system, which my staff is really happy about because they've been working, night and day on unemployment issues and the fallout from that. But in terms of the Senate amendment, it includes additional assistance for restaurants, hotels, and hospitality business. It includes additional assistance for rural businesses and main streets. So Ellicott City, Sykesville, Mount Airy, they're all those main streets get a little bit extra. There is emergency relief for people with suspended unemployment insurance cases, which I think is going to be really, really helpful. There's additional job training for the local workforce development boards. And there's also, let me just pull up this other sheet for a second. What I thought was really, kind of flying below the radar was this economic relief for businesses that don't pay the sales and use tax. So there's like $40 million in there for those types of businesses, which include the service industry, which have been so hard hit during this period. So those are the two big bills moving right now. And of course, the bills that our Small Business Senate group, have been working on are a little bit further behind these kind of flagship bill and amendment.
It was interesting that when I saw the legislation that came out from the Senate that kind of added the additional dollars onto the governor's bill, in particular the one about the modification in terms of adding relief for those businesses that don't collect sales tax, because I think it was just last week, Josh and I were having a conversation with Delegate Feldmark, and that was what actually, ironically, one of her concerns with the governor's legislation. And so it was interesting to see kind of her comments on Monday. And obviously there were a number of other legislators thinking the same thing. And then to see the Senate package, I think, introduced, as you mentioned, whether that was, I don't know, Wednesday or Thursday or what day it was, but that to be in there, because certainly I think that was something that was, many had a lot of concern when you think about, a lot of the service industries, whether that's, salons and stylists and perhaps landscaping and so forth. But Josh, anything you want to add or ask?
Well, I think, Senator, at some point we will get back to some sort of what, passes for normalcy, right? As vaccine distribution, hopefully, right, sooner rather than later. There's hope in the horizon. When you look, beyond that, what do you see for your district specifically? Some of the challenges beyond that you would hope that the General Assembly and will start to either look at or is already looking at addressing going forward.
So, interesting question. I think that what happened with the COVID-19 pandemic is it really brought light to some of the existing challenges we were already facing. And so going forward, in addition to the COVID relief, things that I personally have been, focused on, we've already talked about, helping small business, but I think that needed additional help even before the pandemic. Closing the digital divide, I feel, is incredibly important. There's still some people who don't have access within Howard County, and also there's some sections of Carroll County that really need some support. Three other things that are longer term that I'm focusing on. One is improving our state's ability to respond to flooding and climate change. That, of course, we've seen the horrific impacts in Ellicott City, but Maryland has the second most vulnerable coast after Florida because of the amount of the tributaries in Chesapeake Bay. So I'm working on a state revolving loan program that to help provide access to capital for resiliency projects. Longer term also, I'm really passionate about providing support for mental and behavioral health. And there's a major amendment in the Kirwan legislation, which helps to provide access to mental health through the schools. But this interim, I had a really interesting opportunity to work with the Lieutenant Governor on something that's called the sequential intercept model. And what that refers to is the many different intercepts from the community to initial detention, the courts, and then release from jail to probation and parole, that our judicial system, our law enforcement system interacts with people with mental and behavioral health. And so I fully support the police accountability and reform package. At the same time, not incarcerating people with mental health issues, I think is just incredibly, incredibly important. So I'm focused on that. And the last thing I'll point out is just, I sit on the Education, Health, and Environment Committee, and obviously the long-term, making sure we have, world-class education here in Maryland, and that the kids graduating, can go to college and or get a job. I think that's just incredibly important in the long term. So it kind of spans the gap between immediate relief for all these things, and there is stuff for mental health, in this package. But then going long term, what does the next decade look like in terms of providing solutions to these ongoing challenges?
And so I think on the education scene, that maybe we could stay there for a second. And so I know you mentioned the committee that you sit on, and obviously the whole discussion around Kerwin has continued to be a big one, particularly last session, and obviously coming back this year with the governor's veto of the legislation last year. And so kind of just maybe, I guess, share perhaps particularly maybe the thoughts, I think, in terms of not so much maybe the veto, or even the override of the veto, but more so discussions as it relates to maybe next steps with Kerwin. Because I think that now, there's a lot initially in the initial legislation, but certainly I think as you touched on it, whether that's digital divide or other issues that have come up now, and it's almost like, oh, we didn't think about that because obviously no one anticipated COVID. And so what perhaps are some of the conversations taking place in your committee as it relates to maybe things that need to be, I don't know if the word is fixed, but maybe modified or added or adjusted, just in terms of that we've learned because of COVID, and should there be, a Kerwin Bill 2, so to speak, but just maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Anytime there's a major piece of legislation in one year, there's often a cleanup bill the next year. And so this year, I think we'll see the override followed immediately by the cleanup bill. But I think it's going to be more than just technical cleanup, because, as you said, we've learned so much during the COVID-19 pandemic and the impacts on our teachers and on our kids. I mean, I've obviously got two wonderful daughters who are in 6th and 9th grade. And so I see daily what their life is like. So I think in the follow-up to the Blueprint for Maryland's Future bill, we will see a significant additional funding for tutoring and summer school to address learning loss. That learning loss, is real, and it's an equity issue. It has disproportionately hurt many of the kids who are, already kind of behind for various reasons. I think in order to provide that funding, we'll probably need some kind of statewide standard mechanism to address the actual amount of learning loss that occurred, to get that baseline measurement and make sure that we're addressing the problem, correctly. Everybody wants their kids to go back to school, in a safe manner. And so I think providing additional funding for PPE, for testing, for the revamping of the HVAC systems with these, filters that help to prevent the spread of the disease. I mean, that is really, really important. And I've been on several briefings with superintendents where, I can't remember if it was PG County or I think it was PG, but they were saying that they had $20 to $30 million of upgrades to their school buildings that were necessary, in order for the air quality to be safe to bring kids back. So while the governor has put some money in the budget for those upgrades, when we override the veto, that will also unleash the Built to Learn Act, which allowed the state to bond and invest $2 billion worth of school improvement. So I think that that's absolutely critical to getting our kids back, in school. I think you'll also see potentially these concentration of poverty grants maybe be speeded up in terms of how they are, allocated throughout the blueprint. And then on the digital divide and technology part, there's at least three things that I'm working on. And then I know that other people are working on things too. So I think that it's kind of all hands on deck with respect to the digital divide. The first thing is a slight adjustment to the formula in the Blueprint for Maryland's Future that allocates a specific additional amount to help families and schools and families with internet access. And that includes funding that the schools can determine how best to spend, but it could be used for devices or access to internet and or additional technical support. I mean, some of these school systems have like one media person for like 2,000 students. And so you imagine how long that help desk line is, right? So that's one thing, is it's some additional funding specifically to address this area. Secondly, Senator Elfreth and Delegate Brooke Learman have a bill to change the Office of Rural Broadband to the Office of Digital Inclusion. And so that really ramps up the number of people and the scope of that office to acknowledge that bridging the digital divide is a statewide issue. It's not just occurring in the rural areas, but wherever it is, we need to have the mapping done, we need to have the investment done. And that brings me to the third piece of legislation that I'm introducing, which is on behalf of MACO, the Maryland Association of Counties, which is a dig once law. And that basically means that anytime the state is, digging along a state highway and also the counties along a county road, there's the opportunity for the providers to kind of piggyback and to lay cable, at the same time that we're digging it up once. It also has the brilliant benefit for all of my constituents that they're only having their road digged up once. So that's a nutshell of what I think we will see following on the Kerwin or Blueprint for Maryland #2.
Excellent. Josh, anything you want to add on that?
Well, I think, Senator, first, thank you for your leadership efforts, I think, on this subject about the digital divide. And I think as you captured it, it is complex, and right, it's issues of both access and engagement, right? And everything, as you had said, from having enough support personnel to be able to help parents cope with technical questions, right, as you're doing distance learning, to obviously unserved areas in rural communities and the partnerships that require. And obviously we at Comcast have continued to support partnerships in this area. But I think, like I said, it's great to hear. I think from your standpoint that it is complex and it's not a one size fits all solution. And these issues, as you said before, existed before the pandemic. They're just made a lot more in sort of stark relief now. And then how do we position going forward?
Right. No, I think we're definitely on the same page there. And I just point out that it's not just, the school systems which are impacted. It's small business. I mean, during this pandemic, if you don't have online commerce, you're really not doing very well. And, also agriculture. I mean, the broadband issue for precision agriculture is really important to, protecting the nutrients and protecting the bay. And the technology exists, but if you can't get a signal, you can't get a signal.
Yeah, and speaking of that, how do you feel? I guess ultimately, I'm assuming this should also be something that we should be following in Howard County. And so, particularly when we look at the agricultural components of the western part of the county, which obviously gets into your district and so forth. So I'm just curious, have you spoken or had a number of conversations with some of the agribusinesses that are in the western part of the county, and how do they see this being able to support their efforts?
I think that the Farm Bureau, statewide, and farmers locally in the district, definitely support, anything we could do to make sure that they all have, access to high-speed internet. I thought you were going a different direction about about the program, but I would just say that I give a shout out to all of the farmers and the essential workers who have provided the food that we eat during this pandemic. We've worked locally to connect our farmers to food banks, and there's statewide programs as well. But they've really stepped up and worked hard, and they've been very, very busy in the past year.
Yeah. So speaking of, I guess as we go with these next few minutes, I know you've introduced some legislation that we were able to support particularly in testifying in support of on the House side, just because of conflict. But maybe talk a little bit about. I know you're looking at the private investment or the private equity and work there in terms of really being able to supply funding for our startups here in Maryland, and to really encourage entrepreneurship and so forth. So maybe if you would, share a little bit about that legislation, as well as any other legislation that you're kind of have your eye on, whether that's a co-sponsor or a sponsor, particularly that might be in support of business and so forth.
Okay. And once again, thank you for coming over to the House side to testify. Throughout the course of, all the research that the bipartisan Senate Small Business Work Group did, we identified access to capital as one of the key barriers, and problems that was happening immediately, but also existed longer term. So I'm working with Delegate Brooke Learman on two key pieces of legislation. The first is the angel investor tax credit, which is specifically geared towards some of these innovation economy businesses that were able to grow in the state of Maryland, because we have the initial R&D from the federal government, but then keeping them here and growing them here in Maryland can be challenging if they can't get that access to capital. And so this is basically a tax credit for those people who are able to invest now in these small startups to keep them going and to keep that money flowing. So that is one key provision. The second bill that we'll be introducing is also works with banks, with CDFIs, and with credit unions to be able to open up a new source of loans for businesses, small businesses who may need loans $250,000 or less, which have slightly riskier credit. And what this bill would do is it would leverage, hopefully, federal funding on the state and then on the state side to back these financial institutions in terms of kind of a loan guarantee to enable these institutions to offer loans to smaller businesses with potentially riskier credit. And it's really kind of exciting because it really help at this point in time. And there is a provision in the Biden package which would make it almost hopefully cost neutral to the state.
Excellent. Couldn't get myself off of mute.
I know the feeling.
Yeah, but that's good to hear. And just so you'll know, I'm actually, interestingly enough, having a follow-up meeting with Delegate Learman actually as soon as we wrap up here, and that there were some additional questions asked on the House side, particularly as it relates to equity and inclusion. And so so she reached out, and so I pulled a couple of people in that we're going to be having a follow-up conversation. So look forward to seeing where that continues to go as well.
Yeah, it's really important. The Baltimore Business Journal is an amazing reporting on access to capital and the equity issue. And that first of all led us to both of these bills, and then trying to find ways to ensure that small minority women-owned businesses know about these opportunities without going against the federal regulations on certain issues of equity is really important. So thank you so much for working with us on that.
No, you're welcome. I mean, and also I think as you touched on it, and that it's been reported, we've had also other conversations with folks on the tech side specifically that have also talked about for Maryland as a state, for us to have all the talent that we have at times, trying to grow the talent here, and for companies not to have to leave the state when it comes to capital raises and so forth. I think the more that we have here as a resource to help those firms, and obviously to keep them here as they grow and hopefully add jobs, obviously that's better.
And that's a good example, right, of an effort where that was an existing issue pre-pandemic about access to capital for small businesses, especially minority-owned businesses. And then pandemic hits, minority-owned businesses have been disproportionately impacted from this. But so at the same time, laying the groundwork for the future. So it really is a wraparound in many ways of looking at existing issues, and then as go forward, even past what we're experiencing today.
Great point.
Yeah. So one other area, as we start coming up a little bit close on time, that obviously we're following, and it ties back into a lot of the small business support, and curious as to just kind of your thoughts. And that's dealing, of course, with liability protections for small business and so forth. And so not sure if you've been involved in any, but just interested in your thoughts as to perhaps that area within the Senate and any conversations taking place there.
Yes. I mean, I think unemployment insurance and business liability were the two top issues for many of the chambers involved in our conversations. Senator West, who happens to sit right next to me on the third floor of the James office building when we're in person, he's sponsoring legislation that addresses business liability, but it also includes liability for school systems and for government office buildings. It's kind of a wide scope of this liability issue. And I sponsored it because I think it's really important that we have standards for appropriate accountability and kind of rules of the road without having our small businesses hold this unrealistic amount of liability. And so what Senator West's legislation attempts to do is it says, if you are following the rules, if you're taking every precaution that you're being told you should be taking by the federal, state, and local government entities, you are not liable for the COVID-19 cases that may or may not have occurred on the job or in the store. And the bill explicitly states that the immunity does not include cases of gross negligence or intentional wrongdoing. And I think that that's the right balance. I know it's going to be debated heavily, but we looked at legislation, ranging the entire spectrum. And what Senator West tried to do is to find this middle of the road sweet spot that would be acceptable to people of all political persuasions. So I think where we wound up is that it says, if you're following the rules, if you're making your best faith effort and someone happens to get COVID, it's not your fault unless you're intentionally ignoring the COVID protocols and acting with negligence towards your health and your staff and your customers, then you are absolutely on the hook. So I think this is hopefully the right balance.
No, and hopefully so. I mean, and I think that's ultimately what business is looking for, is not so much to be let off the hook that, hey, if you're wrong, you're wrong. But if you can prove that, hey, we've provided all the PPE, we've put all the safety protocols in place, maybe we've changed the filters, and we've got other remote options and all of those things, and unfortunately something still transpired, that at least they can prove without a shadow that, hey, we did our part. But obviously for those that didn't, that they suffer the consequences. And so as we come close, Josh, any I guess perhaps closing questions or thoughts that you want to share with the senator while we're here?
No closing thoughts. I think at this point, I guess, Senator, I would just leave. A question would be, how is during this time, how do you find communicating and outreaching with folks in your district? Given all the challenges, how has that been?
Well, that's a great question to end on. Zoom and other like online options make it in some ways easier to communicate with folks, so they don't have to come down to Annapolis to testify. At the same time, everything's new. So our sessions are longer, our hearings are longer. So I have less of my actual time available to talk to people. I have great staff, and they're really good at calling people back. And we are in the office, except today because it's snowing. We are in the office. So, if you're welcome to call my office or email us. One of the things we're trying to do, just, following, I don't know who thought of the idea at first, Leonardo, but we are doing Monday night virtual office hours. So if you enjoyed this podcast and you want to hear us talk tonight, every Monday night at 7:00, we do a half an hour to 45-minute kind of what's going on this week from my perspective. And we often have a special guest. And tonight, our guest is Senator Clarence Lamb. And so we're going to be talking about the state of vaccine rollout and how that's going. And there's also a working group on vaccine kind of oversight. And Senator Lamb, Dr. Lamb, is on that oversight working group. So they had a couple meetings. They're having one today, and I look forward to hearing that update for him. So if you're interested, go to katiefryhester.com or follow me on Facebook or Twitter and sign up to get the link to join us tonight at 7.
Excellent. Well, that's good to know, and certainly we'll look for that and try to share that on this end as well. And so, again, as we wrap up, I want to thank you for joining us today and just sharing your thoughts and insights. And certainly we look forward to continuing to work with you in the days and months ahead. And so for those of you, next week, we'll be back here at the same time at 8:30 on Monday, and we'll have with us Delegate Eric Ebersol. He'll be our guest next week. Also, I want to encourage you to continue to follow the Howard County Chamber on a number of legislative matters that we'll be continuing to send updates and alerts on. There's some particularly this week that we'll be following as it relates to kind of everything in terms of definition of essential workers and relief there and so forth. So again, check your emails, read them, follow us on Twitter and Facebook as well. And we'll see you next week. And again, thank you, Senator Hester. And thank you, Josh and Comcast, for your continued support.
Thank you both. Stay safe.
All right.
Thank you.